right, it's Sunday night, so it is time for another episode of Conservatism on Tap. So I am thrilled to be joined by my brother John, and can't wait to talk about a whole mess of stuff tonight. So we are down for it. So first question, as always, John, what you drinking and why?
All right, from Bob Dylan's Distillery, I have Knocking on Heaven's Door right here.
Excellent. Looks great.
The times are changing, Wes. They are changing.
Awesome. I've got Pensacola Bay Brewery, so this is a Lighthouse Porter, so it's right down the street. I love drinking. Are you lifting?
Do what?
Are you lifting?
Oh, yeah, man. Dude, last week we had someone comment that I was apparently weak. Can you believe that? Calling me weak? Because apparently there's a difference between chemical tear gas being used on people and organic tear gas.
Uh-huh.
Crucial difference. And it's somehow linked to my own strength. And I wanted to say, no way, man. Totally, screw you. But being the Burkean conservative that I am,
Uh-huh.
you've got to be able to entertain the notion that maybe there's something to be gained here. Man, there's nothing but gains.
Maybe
Nothing but gains right now.
so. Maybe you were weak, but now you're not, right? Like this is a perfect time to work on yourself and fix it during this show, right? Maybe I should be lifting some weights. I got some dumbbells over here that maybe I can grab. So
I got all kinds of facts on organic tear gas. It's crucial for your protein development, man.
awesome. Well, so we got a lot to talk about. So I just put out this little infographic that I do. I love putting these things together. I've been listening all week to different conservative commentators talking about what's going on. I listen to moderates and liberals, and there are times when it gets a rise out of me, and I just I want to say stuff, and then I slow down and I think about it, and then I try to put it all together. And especially when we talk about things that are as important and dicey as race. I mean, talking about race relations is just a minefield because for so many people, it's like crucially important, and everyone has an opinion on it. And right now, with social media and stuff, like it's just been blowing up the past few weeks, and you had the riots and everything that's going on, and George Floyd, what we talked about, and it's just this minefield. And so I've been taking the time though to slow down and think about it and try to put the different perspectives. And I can't get everything on one graph, but this was kind of my best guess on it. This was my best assessment of the different perspectives that are going on. So you might want to get some more of that liquor because it's going to take a minute to go through this. And I've definitely got my beer here as I walk through it. But here's what we got. So I thought about the differences between, everybody's throwing the word racist around, racism, and all that. And what does that mean? And the people respond to it. So on the left of this graph, as we work through it, and feel free to continue lifting weights, John. But on the left, you've got overt racism. And so I put a picture of the KKK, and I defined it as a belief that humans possess different behavioral traits based on physical appearance. So it starts with that judgment, against someone's skin color. And then, the belief that some races or one race is inherently superior than the others. And then I put a quote from George Wallace. And I think people are, pretty familiar with overt racism. And, you've got groups like the KKK that are still around. But this kind of like targeted, I'm coming after you because of your race type perspective isn't quite as common as it has been in the past. Obviously, without slavery, you don't have segregation. You don't have quite the same overt racism that we did. But there's, of course, discussion. Do we still have that? Do we not? And then I moved towards passive racism, which is the beliefs and attitudes and actions that contribute to the maintenance of racism without openly advocating violence or oppression. And I put a quote there from Patricia Williams where she's saying, how can it be that so many well-meaning white people have never thought about race when so few blacks pass a single day without being reminded about it? And there's like that sign there that says, racism is still alive. They just be hiding it, right? So it's kind of this belief here that the racist infrastructure is still in play, or maybe people aren't intentionally being racist, but unintentionally it's still occurring. So what do you think first on that divide, and then we'll kind of go through the other sections of that.
Well, when you're talking about the overt racism part, I know we're tempted to say it's done. it's not there anymore, or if it is, like it's just in these very, very small pockets. But living in Virginia, Wes, I remember back in 2017 in Charlottesville. I mean, you had another incident where there was a Robert E. Lee monument that was going to be taken down, and you had white supremacy groups and neo-Nazis come on out, and it led to some very, very violent conflict
Yeah.
over there. And now the whole debate is coming back again about these monuments, and these people haven't gone. These people are still there. They're just, they haven't rallied around to fight it out yet, probably because protests and riots are going on all over. So is it still there? It is. Is it as prevalent as it was? Hopefully not, but it is still there. And so you can never say that it's completely gone.
Yeah.
I think with the passive racism, I see certain signs of that, especially in social media today, where they basically say, like, if you're not commenting about what's going on, and you're white, presumably, and you are silent, then that is a form of passive racism. That the fact that you are not wanting to get involved in this debate or in this discussion just shows your privilege and your ability to be far removed from it and not affected.
Yeah.
And it just presumes a lot of racism on people who are not saying anything, which I think can be dangerous, as we'll probably find out here in the next few pictures that you'll have. But that is a small form of projecting that onto somebody else. Is this idea that if you are just trying to look the other way, or you're trying to think that it shouldn't all matter, why should it matter? Then that's a form of racism in itself, or at least a form of privilege,
Yes. There's this
minimally.
judgment, right, that kind of assumes that a person is racist, or that presumes that they have the worst possible intentions by what they said. And, maybe that person doesn't have that. You've got to ask them to find out. And sometimes there is this, oh, if you're silent on this, then you must not care. And that really presumes a lot, especially with social media. Maybe this person is sick. Maybe they're at home. Maybe they got a whole lot going on. They've lost their job, they lost their house, or they're going through some kind of family situation. Just because they're not posting on this doesn't mean they don't care. So I kind of agree with that. It's definitely tricky when you get into the passive stuff, because it's this type of thing that is much harder to see and to judge, is whenever you're saying, okay, it's unintentional or it's behind the scenes. And so that's where that communication comes in. What's not really
Hmm.
hard to see is the next one on here. So I put cultural appropriation, and I've got the photo of Elizabeth Warren because not particularly just picking on her. I mean, obviously, Democrat, liberal, someone that we're not necessarily aligned with, but really what I'm saying here is this is one of the most glaring examples that people can be familiar with, where it was pretty clear that she was using a very, very small makeup, if any at all, of her, heritage and history and ethnicity to try to be able to say, look at me, I'm a minority, and put that through her record. Now, whether she got gain out of that or not, I don't know. But what is clear is that the Cherokee Nation was not having it. They really didn't appreciate it. They have this open letter to her that you can go and see, and you've got all these people who have signed it. And I quoted it right there where they're saying, as you seek denomination, your history of false claims to American Indian identity and the defense of these claims with a highly publicized DNA test continue to dog your political career. And they give their
Hmm.
perspective. They say, for Native Americans, this moment is more than an annoyance. And they go on to say, there's a whole history of white people claiming to be Native American when they're really not doing anything to be involved with the culture, and then
That's right.
trying to benefit out of it. And whether or not you personally got anything out of this doesn't matter. You've already influenced them. And so, what is cultural appropriation? It's basically when you assume these different aspects of a culture, and you do it not with an actual interest in the culture or a link to it or an appreciation for those people, but you do it for your own gain. And that's kind of the other side of this narrative, is if you are, going against passive racism, you're going against the whole system, but you're not actually appreciating the cultures, the minorities, or whomever it is that you're supporting. You don't actually have a direct link with them. You don't actually like have any ties, but it's convenient for you to do that. And that really isn't a form of racial equality at all. That's you trying to profit off of it. So what do you make of that?
Right. I was thinking as you were talking about one of my favorite Christian singers like Rich Mullins, not just because of his honest lyrics and how gritty he can be and down to earth, but because he identified with the Native American community, not only by blood, but through action. So much of his concerts and so much of his time and his giving was towards the community that he identified with.
Yeah.
And it's all, I think, what this tells me is that it's not just blood. When you're a cultural identity, isn't just about the amount of blood that you have that's related to this or that ethnic minority. It's about the stories that you tell. It's about the stories and the way that you relate to that culture and how that culture relates back to you, and how you integrate. It's not simply something that you can just leverage for political gain. That's despicable. And it's certainly something that shouldn't be tolerated. But it happens, I think, far too often, where it's just, oh, look, Ancestry.com showed me that I'm part this and I'm part that. So obviously now I can relate to this community all of a sudden, as if this is my people. Like, have you spent time with them? Have you talked with them? Do you know the stories that they tell? Do you know the culture and the practice they live by? And if so, then I think you've got a little bit more of an argument.
Yeah, it's specifically hearing from the Cherokees themselves saying, no,
Yeah.
like absolutely not. Like, you don't.
It's
You don't.
embarrassing.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where it becomes appropriation. So that's one of those mines in the minefield to avoid. And then really interesting because I've seen so many shares of these videos and stories and stuff, bringing back an interview that Morgan Freeman had as we start to talk about color blindness. And so that's the intent, to treat individuals equally without regard for race, culture, or ethnicity. It's basically saying, listen, let's just stop talking about it. And that's what he says in an interview. He says, stop talking about racism. That's essentially how you beat it. Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace, that's who was interviewing him, and you know me as Morgan Freeman. So there's this kind of space to occupy where we just don't talk about ethnicity or culture or race. Like obviously, we see it, but we don't actually like do anything more than a passing acknowledgement, and it goes away. The racism, overt, passive, the appropriation. Obviously, you can't appropriate something if you're not talking about it. And then I think the hope with this is that if people are making a determined effort to be colorblind, then there's less of a chance of them being like unintentionally racist or offensive, right? So what do you make of that? I'll bring it back up here again as we work through this.
Yeah.
The
You
colorblind
know,
approach.
I know, obviously I know actor Morgan Freeman, but I was a little bit surprised to see that he was advocating this kind of mentality. And I don't know how far he wants to follow through with that, or if it was just more of a mental exercise. I think it is useful as a particular exercise. I could see using that in the classroom in some way, of like, what is lost when you refer to, when you see me as just Jonathan and the color doesn't matter. Or for your friend and they're black, you say, you're not black to me, you're just this person. Like, what is gained, what is lost? And I think, where I fall on the spectrum of it is that there's so much lost if you're trying to go by color blindedness. I think there's a lot to be gained by acknowledging that there are differences between us. It starts with the color, and that leads us into a whole discussion about the history, and in ways that you have experienced your people and your culture there, and then the way that you can relate that to other people groups as well. So I think that colorblindness doesn't go so far out of an exercise in my mind, in far as utility, but I know that some people advocate it as a complete sociological philosophy of being, hey, all this should not matter. We don't need to acknowledge that if you're describing somebody, don't start with their skin color. That should not be your first indicator, because that could lead towards, this prejudice and this racism. So I think they're trying to eliminate the prejudice aspect of it through color blindness, but I think you lose a lot more.
Yeah, I would say first off, because I mean, you see this from a lot of conservatives right now. You see this from people like Candace Owens and Prager University, and a lot of these guys are saying
Okay.
America is a colorblind society, and that's a great thing, and we're way ahead. And I think Morgan Freeman said something to that effect too when he actually put this quote out. And so, in many ways, it's obviously better than being an overt racist. It's better than a passive form of racism where you're insulting someone, you're coming at them with a race, whether intentional or not. It's definitely better than appropriation. So it is a better thing. But I agree with you about what is lost, and I want to bring this up. This is a graph from we talked about it last week, and it says that from a Pew Research study that blacks are more likely than any other groups to see their race or ethnicity as central to their identity. And it's got the numbers there showing 52% of blacks surveyed consider their race or ethnicity central to their identity to the point of being extremely important, and 22% say that it's very important. And then when you look at whites, it's only 5% saying extremely important and 10%. So essentially 74% of blacks saying that it's very important or more, and only 15% of whites. And so if this is something that is very important to the person you're talking to, then when you say, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm colorblind, like I don't care about it, I refuse to see it, in many ways, that's you taking a step away from racism. But at the same time, you don't want that to be taken as, hey, I don't care about something that for you is extremely important to your identity. And I don't think that's going to change. But that's how it can be interpreted, John, is you can be trying to say, hey, I am against the racist. I don't want to be linked up with them. And so I'm stepping out into this whole colorblindness space. But then that can be perceived by someone else as you're dismissing something that is very, extremely important to me. And that's why you can get some of the reactions that you do. And so that's what I'm
Yeah,
trying to show with this. Go ahead.
I think that, thinking a little bit more about it too, from where I've heard of it, just being advocated, is that it's meant to try and create commonality, right? It's meant to try and say, like, we come from two different spheres, but let's focus on the fact that we are both people. If you're, honestly, if you're a Christian, if you're not, like, Christians might say that we're made in the image of God. You might have someone who's just say, hey, we're made of stardust. Either way, we're we're made of very valuable stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. We are all people in this. And I think what colorblindness is trying to advocate is the sense of we need to try and focus on what makes us the same. Right, we need to try and focus on the fact that we are humans first. But at some point, I don't see this being advocated. At some point, you're going to have to come to the reality that we don't have the same skin color. That is, and that is the truth of it, and that leads to a whole host of new conversations that need to be had because there's a lot of history there, there's a lot of culture there, that makes a difference, and that difference doesn't have to mean only bad things and prejudice. But I think insofar that colorblindness creates a unity of human value, awesome. But if you're trying to say it will never matter, color will never matter, it does.
Well, so that's where I put another section on this called ethnic pluralism. And I'll kind of define that because it's kind of a weird phrase, but it means recognizing, appreciating, valuing, and learning about cultural, racial, and ethnic differences. And there's this amazing video between some leaders in the U.S. military, specifically in the Air Force, because they have a black senior enlisted leader and they have a white officer leader, the chief of staff over all the Air Force. And they did this talk on a YouTube video where they just went back and forth, like discussing what was going on in the world and learning from each other. And one of the quotes that the senior enlisted leader said was, these conversations about race are difficult and tough, but they are necessary. You have to be able to talk about this. And more than talk, you have to be willing to listen. And he specifically says he wants his boss, the chief of staff, to listen to the stories of black airmen and what's going on, and for them to be comfortable to tell their stories. And that's the difference, John, is instead of, that's where it's different from the color blindness, is that this Chief Wright is saying they are necessary. It's necessary to talk about this, that you have to be willing to talk and then to listen. And that goes counter to the color blindness approach of let's just not talk about it at all. So now that being said, one of the things I wanted to do was not title this multiculturalism, because that word for a lot of people means the same as cultural relativism. Is you can get to this point where we listen to someone talk about their culture, talk about their background, talk about their history, to the point that that's all that matters, and then there is no values above it. There is no right and wrong because this is my culture, and that's a tough conversation to have. But I think there's a balance there. I think there's the ethnic pluralism. What I mean by that is you still have a system of right and wrong, but you have a culture and I have a culture, and we discuss it. And even if we're different, we can appreciate each other. But here's the key point: we don't have to agree on every aspect of it. And I think that can be lost, and that's where you get the multiculturalism, is where they get to a point where, oh, that's just how their culture is. And to me, you can go off the deep end very quickly because what if you have a
Yeah.
culture that's doing horrific things? You know, you can think back to like ancient Aztecs or whatever it is. You can think back to different cultures. We have problems in our own culture, of course. And if we get to the point where we don't have to look at those because that's our culture, then you've lost it. So I'm really not trying to say that, but I
Mm.
was trying to say I think that there is a a mature way to have this conversation. It can be difficult, but it does. It involves listening, but it doesn't involve suspending your judgment. So, what do you make of that?
Mm. You're reminding me about some of the assignments I had back in college. It was during my lifespan development class, which was advocating that life is complicated, it's dynamic, there's a lot of factors going around with it. Everyone has their own factors in their own life and their own people
Yeah,
that are all shifting and shaking. And as a result, life can be pretty unpredictable. And as a result, it can be mysterious. And our teacher wanted us to start interviewing people who are of a completely different um, to a person than us in regards to either age, sex, or in regards to philosophy, or in regards to ethnicity. And so I think that is a really good exercise to really challenge other people rather than like it's easy to post comments. It's honestly easy to do a podcast here. It's a lot harder to sit down with somebody else and to actually write out a page and say, "Hey, can you just tell me a little bit about your life, maybe one specific moment?" Usually I approach those conversations with, "Tell me of the three most important decisions that you had to make in your life."
yeah,
And why you feel that those were important, and I would write a page on that. But they were nothing but stories that you ended up learning about how people develop in their life, and it would be very, very amazing to see that. Can you imagine if that would be a trend that would just shoot off and say, here's the person that I talked to, and here's a page about their life, and this is what I learned about them. I think that there would be tons of benefit because all it is just you listening to somebody else. It is asking literally maybe one or two questions and hearing a person's story. I think that that needs to happen more often, but
yeah.
too often, even social media, even when you're trying to advocate for something that is useful and something that is non-polarizing, it still feels like you are just pushing and constantly pushing. Listening is not glamorous. It's not going to get you likes. It's not going to get you more comments. It's not going to make you feel like you made a huge difference with people. It's not going to be rooted in history. It's going to change you.
Yeah.
And that's what I think needs to be stressed more often.
Well, I'm going to look at this one last time before we move on. But if you think about the racial debate in the way that you just laid out and that we just described, things start to make sense, right? As you see some of the people who advocate for color blindness, and like essentially what they're saying is this is not anything to the left on this graph. This is not overt racism. That's true. It's better. This is not passive racism. How can it be passive racism if it's color blindness? This is not cultural
Uh-huh.
appropriation. They're saying that it's beneficial to those things. But then you have people who are expecting this conversation to happen. They're expecting people to learn about their culture and appreciate it, right? And then you have then they're saying the color blindness doesn't work for me. And the color blindness people are saying, what do you call me, a racist, right? And sometimes they probably do because they're to the left of them, right? And so you kind of see how this debate like gets very angry and it gets very vitriolic because people are quick to assume, hey, someone who is believes in the ethnic pluralism says you're not good enough, and then that person responds, assuming that they're pushing them to the left, and maybe they say it that way. But you can kind of see we're in different spots, and if we can identify ourselves more specifically, then we have a chance, to communicate better as opposed to dismissing, each other. I saw a video, and maybe we'll do this next Sunday, and he was saying that if you don't believe in color blindness, then you're against Martin Luther King's dream, that you're evil,
Ooh.
and that's not true
Mm.
because
Okay.
Martin Luther King did talk about being judged by your character, not by your skin color, but he also talked about retaining your ethnicity and your culture and the importance. He talked about little black boys and little white girls holding hands, their color retained. You can think about this in a theological sense of, in Christianity, in heaven, in Revelation, we still retain our tribe, our tongue, our color, our ethnicity. So there must be some value to that, right? So is color the ultimate important thing in, say, a religious sense? Maybe not, but it's still something that God gave us and still has some meaning, hence why we retain it. And so you kind of can work through those debates, but you can recognize I see you coming from a point of color blindness. Maybe we can both agree that overt racism is wrong. Maybe we can both agree that
Hmm.
cultural appropriation is wrong. We can find points to agree as opposed to slamming each other. So anyway, that's kind of where I was coming at from this. Kyle just jumped on and put a comment. He said it worked out for Remember the Titans, and that's a good freaking movie, man. I love that movie. I haven't seen that in like 10 years. Strong side, left side, but they get to maybe they go through some of these stages, right? Maybe they go through, that there's the overt racism that you saw that from some people in that movie. Maybe we should do a film review on this. And then you see there's some passive racism. The guys on the team, they weren't intentionally like, they were just trying to do what's good for the team. And then they get to a point where they hit that color blindness and all right, we're just going to make this work. We have to. So let's just not talk about it. But then you get to the point where what is it? Bertier, isn't that like one of the main characters? And then I want to say like um, Julian or something like that
Gosh.
is the
Yeah,
guy.
that's it. Julian and Bertier. That's right.
To a point where they call each other brothers and they appreciate each other as they are. They're not trying to steal each other's culture. I'm not trying to make you act like me, and I don't have to act like you, but we can appreciate each other and we can work together and like lead our team. So that's a great place. Same thing
We
with the coaches, right? Denzel and his
yeah,
coach. Yeah.
you have some representation in all those characters. You have the guy who's the overt racist. He's like all the overt racism is consolidated into like one character, of the team who ends up, I think, getting
I think
kicked off and
yeah, or something
shunned by
like that.
everybody because there's only one guy. And then you've got like, yeah, Julian and Bertier who end up getting that kind of sense of colorblindness. But what's significant, and I think where you might even see the limitation of that colorblindness is that other people don't give that same kind of courtesy. So like you've got Sunshine, who's the guy who just feels like I'm with everybody, it's no big deal. And like what he finds is that he's welcome inside a certain establishment, but like his friends who are black are not welcome there at all.
Yeah,
And so even though he feels like, well, I can see past the differences and it doesn't mean that much to me, they're just my brothers. Like he has to be able to reconcile the differences because whether he likes it or not, he's seen as being white by other people, and his friends are being seen as black, and he can't understand that. And they even turn their back on him for a bit because he can't recognize why this is such a big deal. So, I mean, if for only reason that the fact that the institutions are flawed, like colorblindness only gets you so far
yeah,
personally.
yeah.
You're not going to be able to get that everywhere.
So maybe that's what I'll do. I'll redo this graph just using Remember the Titans pictures and like characters. There you go. Maybe that'll make it less offensive to Elizabeth Warren, who's candidacy
I think what
officer
I like about that
for
movie is that
multiple reasons. But there you go.
I like those actors are like in like their mid-20s, late 30s or something like that, and they're like playing high school students. That's what's funny about it.
Yeah. All right. So we've only got a couple minutes left. So let's get into a couple comments and kind of respond to them about this graph, and then we'll call it a day. So Christopher, one of our top fans and a guy who's been on the show a couple times, said, "I feel like it's missing systemic racism, but I suppose that isn't really a belief or an approach. It's bigger than that." And yeah, so when you think about systemic racism, that's that word that's being thrown around all the time. Systemic racism just means that like it's widespread, right? It's pervasive to some extent. It's like in the system. And so when you look at overt racism, of course, it's systemic because like, they were doing slavery, they were doing segregation. Like there was all these horrible practices that, have since been gone. And, that's being dismissed. When you look at passive
Right.
racism, that's where it gets complicated because how systemic is it? And that's like the debate that's going on, right now is, well, how can it be systemic and passive at the same time if you don't actually know it, if it's not in the legal system, and then people are looking at the effects, like, how many black people are making the same as white people? Like, let's look at education levels, or let's look at, studies about cops and how they treat people, and it gets a little more difficult. But when you think about this in terms of systemic racism, that's again where that clarity is needed. What are you talking about? Because the conservatives will
Yeah.
come back and they'll say, if you're thinking that it's just as systemically racist as it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, well, then there's all this data and there's all this facts. But if what you mean by that is passive racism, well, then that's going to be harder to prove. But maybe you can be more clear about the attitudes and beliefs that people have. And frankly, there are ways to measure that, and people don't cite that enough, I think. So
I think too, and this is ironic because Remember the Titans does talk about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War and that was
yeah,
fought, and he's talking about how like if we're not careful, we're just going to keep fighting the same battles over and over and over again in our lives. But you can see that, you know, people concentrate the systemic racism into monuments, into statues. Like they are, whether they were built like that or not, they are absorbing all of the racial tension of our community into like small locus points all throughout the nation.
right,
Obviously more throughout the South. And so as a result of that, like people are wanting to bring those monuments down. I know we probably don't have a whole lot of time to talk about all of that, but I think that's important to see that people associate the systemic racism with these markers that are systematically littered throughout, you know, the South, and that's like an emblem of so long as this stands, I can tell that you honor the fact that racism will always be there. It will
yeah,
always be this underlying story in a passive sense. It may not be advocating violence, although in 2017 it kind of did, but it, when will it do that again? Will it do that in 2021? Let's bring these things down, and that's why you have that going on. We'll probably talk about that next time,
sure.
but yeah, that's going on.
Yeah. And let's look at a couple other comments here. So Dan says, the lesson here is that it will never be enough. So stop trying. Unless you are willing to get on your knees and kiss your boots and give up your kids' futures, you will always be the enemy. Time for conservatives to grow up. Multiculturalism has failed. And so that's kind of like so Christopher's coming more from the left side, and then Dan's coming from, the right side. But I actually agree just to an extent with Dan. That's why I didn't call it multiculturalism with the ethnic pluralism, because it gets into that relativism of if we start like losing our sense of morality as we try to appreciate cultures, then we're losing something that's ultimately important. And so what is the goal here? Is color blindness the goal, or is ethnic pluralism the goal? And then how will we know when we've got there? And so I can certainly sense some of that frustration. I think that's where that communication comes into play. Of if you believe in the color blindness approach, then articulate the benefits of that and why you're there as opposed to one of these other spots. But I can certainly understand the
Hmm.
frustration of like, hey, what do I have to do for someone to understand that their culture is important? You know, I understand it's important to them. It's important to me too. So I can understand that. And then the last one is Angelo, who says, to me, race is a human construct. And I think he's talking about the notion that culture is being built up all around race to the point that we have manufactured all kinds of beliefs that are inherent in skin color. And I think he's more going for that color blindness approach that we talked about. Maybe he sees that as a benefit.
Yeah, maybe so. I think that, with race as a social construct, you have that sense of like, for instance, someone could be born white in a completely black family, for just various other reasons. Or, you might have an interracial family and that child might be born black or white. But because they're born black, all of a sudden they have all of the stories and all of the connotations and the things like that that come with, and the meaning that comes with having black skin, but their brother or sister who's born with white skin has all of the meaning and all of the privilege all of a sudden and the prejudice that comes with the prejudice of having white skin. So in that way, it seems so artificial on that front that does race actually exist? We've kind of constructed it to have all of this meaning, and that's why I think that on an institutional level it's hard, and on a sociological level sometimes it's hard to get this idea of true ethnicity and the value that comes from an ethnicity that you really adhere to, that you identify with, and that you've bonded to, which is why we had that criticism of like cultural appropriation, right? Where it's just like, oh yeah, I'm a little bit this. Really, like, are you really? Did you go to their gatherings? Is your family like what practice have you adopted from that culture that shows us that's who you are, or is it just because you're a percentage of that blood? Like, I think that there's a whole conversation there to talk about constructed race versus true ethnicity, and sometimes that gets confused with how we behave towards one another. It just does, for the ease of prejudice or cataloging one another into a certain people group.
And I'll mention this very quickly, but it's those extreme positions, it's and the intolerance, and that's what really kills it. And I see that with the police debate, and I'll show this photo that we put together with a quote from Burke, and you have all these people that are saying defund the police and we don't need them, and saying take away their money and put it in other places. But Burke would say a jealous, ever-waking vigilance to guard the treasure of our liberty not only from invasion, but from decay and corruption is our best wisdom and our first duty. And he would be, I think, in favor very much so of having law enforcement and investing in those people and recognizing the need for them. So maybe that's something we'll talk about next time as we'll kind of get into human nature and his beliefs about that. Because when you take those extreme positions of you have to do all these things, like you said, if you don't, agree with me, then I'm going to defriend you on Facebook, and everyone needs to hashtag exactly what I'm saying right now. Otherwise, you're racist. Like when you get to those extreme positions, that's when you start to lose people. You start to lose that dialogue that's so important. So anyway, thanks for participating with
Right.
me. Hope you got a good workout in. I had some good beer, so enjoy
Dude,
that.
I think I had like I have to rewatch this. I think I had like 5 shots of like Bob Dylan's like whiskey. This is awesome.
I
I
don't
keep
think I
going all
drank and
night.
worked at the same time, but that's like the channeling your Vince Vaughn, right? And
Right. Well, if I may, I mean, if anyone is watching, anyone wants to learn some good weightlifting techniques, okay? I've been doing this for clearly forever. No, but if you are wanting to know more information about the Burking Conservative, whether you are liberal, libertarian, Republican, hard right, left, or moderate, or still trying to develop your views, which we all are, I encourage you to share us with, DM us your email, hit subscribe, follow us. We really want to talk with you. We're sharing a book club here. If you want to join that, please feel free. Keep the discussion going. We'd love to see you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Johnny. We'll see you next week.
All right. See you around.